It wasn't even anything I was going to show you, so seriously, it took me that long before I realised I had this talk. What are you studying?
Yeah, well, we were both like, I mean, it's so easy.
Yeah, but I'm doing it.
Alright, so thank you very much everybody for joining us. Technical difficulties is the theme of the day. Well, that's alright, we're going to get to space so it doesn't happen. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining us again here for another session. Now we've got, I think, what's going to be a really it's going to be a really fascinating topic. So before we talked about space law and discovered that space law is a thing, and that's really cool, I think another incredibly interesting intersection of two very, well, what not many people think about is space or technology in general and ethics. So we've got a space ethicist extraordinaire, Dr. Evie Kendall, joining us here today to talk to us all about the trolley problem and much more. Everybody knows the trolley problem. But why we need to consider ethics when we're developing new technologies and new solutions and new businesses. So everybody, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Evie Kendall.
Okay, so thank you lovely humans for coming. I know you're busy actually doing your space acts. You're laughing at my gender neutral, extremely inclusive language there, lovely humans. And of course, we will also have some aliens. Yes, we will be inclusive of the alien talk as ethics, so there's not a lot out there, but that just means that we get to help create it together at the moment. So, ethics. People have different definitions for ethics, and no one person's ethics is going to be the same as someone else's. So when I use the term ethics, I'm looking at what we ought to do. So personal or social views of right and wrong, occasionally you'll find people use the term interchangeably with morality, and that will more often happen in a sort of religious setting as well. So I'm just looking at that first one, what should we do? So, who is actually familiar with our trolley problem that Troy mentioned? Yes. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. So what is space ethics? This is what we ought to do in space endeavours. So that includes the technology we should develop, what kind of commercial activity we should allow, and whether or not militarisation in space is appropriate, and if so, to what degree, and who should be able to control what. Now, we're not going to use the two words that we hear a lot about space and military at the moment, but you know what I'm thinking of is... The other thing to consider is, of course, ethical obligations that we have to space environments. So this image here is just labelled space junk. So we have a few space lawyers in the room, or at least emerging space lawyers, and they're going to be quite interested in how we actually punish people, if necessary, for space pollution. So things that they have not taken care of in their commercial pursuits. So do we owe an ethical obligation to a space environment? Now remembering, we're not doing very well with our ethical obligations for this environment. So we are quite concerned about what we might do in space. Do we have ethical obligations to celestial objects? Should they have any rights in and of themselves? What can we do with them? Should we be allowed to mine an asteroid, for example? What kind of ethical implications do we have there? And then, of course, we have ET. So do we have an ethical obligation to alien life forms? Should we find any? Now, I've included biosignatures because, sadly, what we're most likely to find is actually not an alien that we can converse with. It's more likely going to be some sort of bacterium, and that's okay. We need to consider whether or not that will have rights. So the kind of rights we might be looking at is, does it have the right to continue its existence without human intervention or interference in its natural environment? So remember, this could be something that evolves into a species we can talk to. Probably won't, but it might. And therefore, do we have some sort of ethical obligation to allow it to continue in that way? So, I'm going to give you a quick and dirty rundown of two different ethical theories. This is just a little bit of theory so that you can apply it when I give you some cases to consider for space ethics. Now, some of these are going to be immediately relevant to the startups that you're thinking of. Are you or are you not allowed to do a certain thing in space? Now, some of that is legal, a lot of it is ethical. So, just a little bit of theory, bear with me, it won't hurt too much. Consequentialism. It does what it says on the box. It is focused on consequences. So the right thing to do is that which generates good consequences, or the best possible consequences. So we actually do the math, and we find the greatest good for the greatest number. Remember your trolley experiment? A lot of people will go with, I'm going to save the maximum number of lives by diverting this runaway trolley, which is just a train carriage for those that didn't grow up in the UK. So we're going to divert that so it hits fewer people, greatest good, greatest number. Now you don't have to agree with that, but it does tend to be a common solution to that problem. So utilitarianism is one of the more common formulations of consequentialism, and it holds maximization of utility as your highest ethical obligation. So for your own startups, you might be thinking, how can I do the most good for the most people? So how are we going to save people if we have a planet we can't live on anymore? What are we going to do if we're stuck in a craft that's been hit by a meteor and we've lost our life support? How are we going to actually service the needs of the most people in that situation? So utility is just happiness or preferences. That can be saving lives, that can be saving limbs, whatever it is in the situation. So that's your consequentialist theory. Not too hard. We also have the dominant theory that we have in medical ethics, and a lot of what I teach is medical ethics to future doctors. So this is principlism. So we're focusing on core principles that are supposed to be considered universal. Now, when this was conceived in 1979, when they said universal, they obviously meant all the people on the earth. They weren't really thinking beyond that. Of course, we did have a few people we were interested in that may not have fallen into that category, but they are mostly thinking about human beings on Earth. That's their universe, their universal values. These are challenged for a number of reasons, perhaps because they're not culturally universal. But just to run them down for you so you can apply them in the cases that will come up. Autonomy, this is your respecting people's rights. If any of you have done biomedical science or are medical students, you'll be familiar with this. We say there are 4 core principles, and they are autonomy, 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 and autonomy. This is where we get the idea of consent forms from. So people actually governing what happens to their bodies, for example, when they go to hospital. We're interested in how we might apply that to space. Who is going to give informed consent for what we do on a planetary scale, what we do in outer space, what we do with celestial objects? Are you allowed to mine that asteroid? Maybe you're not. Beneficence, that's producing your maximum good. Non-maleficence is minimizing or avoiding harm. Essentially, don't be evil. So hopefully all of your startup companies will at least satisfy the don't be evil criterion. And justice we're particularly interested in because you probably know space is meant to be the domain for everyone. So everyone should be treated equally and equally benefit from space research. And of course we do hear things like most space research does actually have an impact on Earth. First up, consequentialism. Have a think. You can chat to the person next to you. If we wanted to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, would we include alien life as a person? If we want to do the greatest good for the greatest number of life forms, would we include alien life in that utility calculation? And if we needed to actually terraform another planet so that our species could survive, but this would actually kill another species or an emerging species, would that count against it? Would saving X number of billion human lives be worth it for the consequentialist if we were going to be wiping out the potential for trillions of alien lives? I'm just going to give you a minute to chat to the person next to you, just thinking about, are we going to include alien life in our consequentialist theory? Have a think.
Last one, yeah, because do we just want to do it? Oh, let's say that it's a choice between
just because we want more, then no. But we need to define how our understanding of it being uninhabitable, the risk of it being uninhabitable. And I think like
It's not uninhabitable.
no, for other life forms. Like it's definitely, we're like, yeah, there's definitely other life forms that probably can have that. I don't think we could really, did you say that because they don't exist yet, or else they will be inhabiting it? So we can't really do it.
Yeah, but your issue that okay. So first of all, you've got to go on the basis that there's heaven.
Yeah.
And then you've got the basis that there is amoeba giving you tiny little soft little red jelly.
Yeah.
That eventually turns into a biomedical
like you no longer
Yeah.
or
testing.
the book calls like asteroids. But then again,
I think if
that
we
is
had
a longer term would be for the humans to actually understand the planet.
Okay, if you've just joined us, we're trying to answer the first questions there.
let's say
If we're looking for the greatest good for the greatest number, are we going to include alien life or potential alien life in that calculation?
Yes. That's how good it tastes. What's the difference?
Okay, so it looks like we've got some ideas coming through. I'm overhearing some good stuff about how we treat animals. And was that something about it depends on how big their brain is? How formed they are?
Didn't you say it depends on how tasty they are?
I think that may have been Sam or Hugh here, so thereby it's dependent on that.
That is a good point.
It's a good point, okay. Well, they do say a compelling argument against vegetarianism is bacon. Can't fight you on that one. Okay, so you have absolutely highlighted something that's really relevant for this comparison. How do we treat animals? So that's another life form that we know has the capacity to suffer and that we still don't necessarily treat very well. So perhaps humans can't be trusted. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So are we going to include aliens if we're not currently even including the animals on our own planet?
No, we're not.
Yeah, maybe we're not. Does anyone think that if we're going to go extinct, humanity will just go terraform anything they can get hold of? Yes? Okay, so we are all terrible people. Yeah.
Maybe we're terraforming this planet for aliens to create CO2.
I like it. I like it. So it's very supportive of our alien overlords that are coming. Fantastic news.
I think if we were to ever come across aliens that we could recognise as being similar to ourselves, then well, yeah, it would be war.
Okay.
But I think that there would be much more hesitancy in answering no, yes to these questions.
Okay, so you think the similarity of the human form is going to be relevant there?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it would be war.
And perhaps, yeah, there would be violence, yeah.
We'd lose if they were retreating.
When we talk about sustainable
Absolutely. Absolutely. And precautionary principle does guide a lot of space endeavours, particularly in European countries. That seems to be a dominant sort of ethical mode there. Less so in certain other countries, which has been historically problematic. But yeah, absolutely. If we want to set up these ethical guidelines now and say we want to use that precautionary principle, we don't want to go into any environment we think we might hurt the native life forms, then we're in a position to do that now in a way that perhaps we haven't been throughout most of the history of human exploration. So it's something that we actually can sort of put the brakes on a little bit because we're not in space quite so much as what we could be if we were going to build a colony, for example. So fantastic suggestions there. So I wish we could talk about all of them, but yes, thank you for your ideas, of course. So if we go back to our principles, and as I said, those principles are usually used in medical ethics, so we're just trying to apply them to the space endeavour here. Who should consent to what we do to celestial objects? This was a question that I asked students that were in a medical ethics program. Who should actually say what we can and cannot do with something like the moon or an asteroid or something like that? Because if you go up there in space and you blow something apart and it's actually going to cause significant damage to the local environment or perhaps come back on us, Who decides whether you were allowed to do that? And the corollary that I usually draw here is something like geoengineering. So if you know climate engineering, we have a number of projects that have gone on. They have not necessarily been approved by an ethics committee. In many cases, they haven't. It's been a very wealthy person with the resources to actually engage in their own personal climate engineering. Now, that has the potential to severely damage other communities' weather. You could actually theoretically use it as a form of weaponry. And we don't have a lot of guidance regarding that because it's a very large-scale thing that people haven't really thought about. So they haven't really worked out what we are and are not going to ethically or legally allow in that space. So a few examples have actually gone ahead on this planet. So we're quite worried about what might happen when we actually leave this planet. So who would stop the very wealthy person that happens to want to blow up an asteroid from doing so, even if it's very risky for people back home? So ethical considerations there. And of course, in this particular group of students, they couldn't find a group that should make that decision. So in the end, they fell back on maybe the UN.
That role to national government.
Yes, and that was the problem.
And here, you can't send something up unless the government minister actually says, okay,
Yeah.
you can send it up. You
Yeah.
can't just send it. The government has to say you were allowed to.
Yeah.
So why not Minister for Defence, Minister for Communications, Minister for Environment, whatever?
Ah, yes. But what happens if our national defence or our national environment requires a certain level of care and our action in order to produce that will actually damage somebody else's national interest? So how do we make those decisions? I think was part of the concern.
Yeah.
So if one government is just allowed to launch whatever it wants for its benefit, how does that actually impact other governments and their people? Yeah?
Well, okay, so I was actually on the way here thinking about it, like how you would address. We really shouldn't take any action in space without a clear, well-developed manifesto, however it's structured, from an equitable background.
Yep.
Which isn't going to happen. Well, and I was like, how could you do it? And I was like, well, maybe you could create some sort of like global policy authoring tool that allows for, like open source sort of provisioning and drafting and, sort of facilitate like almost a global digital forum, which is, maybe kind of biased, people here, blah, blah, whatever. And most people just work if it's not doing it. But then you could ideally then get some sort of like statement of intent that like is, global, and then you could say, well, hey, this is what we want, so if you don't do it, then we can tell you not doing what we want. But then there's the whole idea of like a law isn't valid unless it's enforceable, and in space, anyone who's going to be able to enforce it is the one with the biggest gun. So I guess who should consent is the person with the most guns.
It's the person with the most guns.
Well, who should? I think I'm replacing these should with would.
Yes.
A lot of times, what I think might happen. I think who should consent is the people, the workers of the world, basically.
I love it. Well, see, that's just it. If we could set up a global governance system, then we would have interests for the people that didn't have any guns. Because, just like in geoengineering, the countries that are significantly advanced enough to do it are of course not necessarily going to prioritise the interests of the people that are actually most disadvantaged and therefore actually suffering the effects of poor climate right now. So in a few of the conferences that have been led about this, we've had delegations from developing world countries saying we don't want any of this technology developed because we know that we will not be the priority, but we will suffer the bad effects if there are any. So there'll be a sort of disproportionate benefits and sort of harms there. Yeah.
It's also important to have that global, the long, until now we think that with lands, what happens in the farm,
Yeah.
but now we're talking about space.
Yeah.
And as it's happening out there, it's going to come back to us.
Absolutely.
We are not cocoon or protected. So if we try and convey that, and as people who understand that, it is our role to make sure that we're communicating in a language that is understood by an average person to understand the importance of happening.
Yeah.
In the end, they are the ones with the least gun, or the most gun, whoever, everybody's going to suffer the same consequence.
No, I don't buy that argument at all. Global warming. So Margaret Thatcher, probably one of the most conservative politicians we've had in the last 50 years around the world. First politician ever, first leader of a government to bring in climate change legislation. Australian Liberal Party Conservative members love her, even now after she's dead. They love her. But they oppose climate change policy.
Yep.
So people can like a person or an ideology, but very few people are committed to dealing with climate change. So why are we going to deal with something off the planet when that doesn't personally impact any of us?
Important opportunity for particularly space ethics. We are having this problem with climate change, which is saying right now, and people aren't actually stepping up and making the changes that we need. But when people start thinking about space, they have a sort of greater idea of how big it is. People have the idea that space is really, really big, and if we do anything up in space, people do seem to think that that will affect everyone on the planet. Now, the disconnect is people not realising that what's happening with the climate is affecting everyone. I'm hoping that the awareness of space being really big and the Earth being really fragile will actually filter through to the domestic issues that we have. So I'm hoping that will be the relationship, because you're absolutely right, it's not currently the relationship we have with the planet.
We need to show people that the Earth is in space.
Yes. Yes, it is. And of course, you know, the overview effect, looking at the pale blue dot and just how fragile it is, actually inspires people to do better for the planet, for the people in it, but also for the environment, which is what's really inspiring. From the perspective of how do we create an ethics of space, it will actually, I hope, filter down to an ethics for our planet. Yeah.
We can take the exact opposite way and be like, well, with just that tiny little pixel, it really doesn't matter everything like that.
Scrub it out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
you
it's-
absolutely could.
Yeah.
You absolutely could. And there are philosophers who do. Absolutely.
So this is the Hitchhiker's Guide to philosophy.
We are mostly harmless. Mostly
International
harmless.
superhighways that are killing us.
Absolutely. Okay, so we are going to move on. So if you're wondering what space ethics guidance we do currently have, of course we've got UNESCO's policy document there, but more famously, of course, we have the United Nations Outer Space Treaty. So I've put segments of Articles 1 and 2 up there because they are the most relevant for ethics. So we have here, exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. So that addresses some of the concerns that we've had on the floor already. Irrespective of the degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. Humankind. All humankind. Peoplekind. Not mankind.
Being
Absolutely. Being kind. I love it. We can also be kind in that, so it's very good. Here we have, of course, a justice issue, that treating people fairly and having fair distributions of benefits and burdens. So it doesn't matter if you're not actually able to contribute scientifically or financially to the space industry. That is the idea. Yes?
Interesting that it's sort of national.
Yeah, I know.
Yes?
It's like business appropriate.
No, it does not. No, it does not. And you may know that there are licenses being sold for asteroid mining to companies, but not to nations. And the question we have there, well, there's some of them coming through the US. The question we have there is, if we give you a mining license for an asteroid, did we sell you the asteroid or the product of the asteroid? It's like if we have a participant we've recruited for a medical trial in Australia, you probably know you are not allowed to sell your blood. But we can reimburse you for donating your blood in a medical trial because we're reimbursing you for your time and the inconvenience of having an injection. So at what point have we actually crossed that threshold? And the reality is I really am buying your blood. So perhaps it's just semantics there. Perhaps it's the same thing here.
These are articles very different. Have they been applied even as of today? Look at
Not
the
that I'm
space
aware of.
race, right?
Yeah.
So how can we guarantee in future that whatever ethics that we can still define, it can be under United Nations, it can be under a
Yep.
global, but
They
it
can.
cannot be enforced. There is no way in space that you can have like an overseeing somebody sitting in space and trying
Yeah.
to see every rocket which is coming up or going, monitoring like through a gateway, okay, everything. You cannot. Today the problem you have is a space debris.
Yes.
Now, who created that in the first place and who is going to clean up?
Yep.
It's a huge problem for many. You don't know when they are going to fall back onto the earth.
Yep.
It's a bigger problem. So
I
it's
remember
very
some.
difficult going to enforce this. And given with
Yeah.
the technologies the way it is advancing, and there will be a lot of businesses with their own agendas. It's very difficult to monitor everything in space.
Yes, it is. And part of that is because we're currently not trying. So, I mean, yes, it will be spectacularly difficult to set up these guidelines, and it will be even more difficult to enforce them. But I think it's too much of a defeatist attitude to say we can't even try to make ethical guidelines or have some sort of binding arrangement regarding what we're going to do, particularly what are we going to do with the space junk. You are absolutely right, that is a logistical problem. It's also an ethical problem. If you're littering space, that's very much an ethical issue because it's preventing other people from doing the research they need to do. But as you've mentioned, there is a real risk that these things are going to come back down on us. And of course, some countries may have the capacity to deflect that, they might have the technology to deal with that, and others really don't. So we have, again, that unfair distribution of those burdens and benefits of space endeavour. So,
let's have a royal commission.
We probably won't have one of those, but we can try and come up with some sort of global collaboration. So, that was the theory. I told you it wouldn't hurt too much, hopefully it didn't. So now, I actually need you to arrange yourselves as much as you can, approximately into groups of 5. Can we do that? So it doesn't matter if it's literally 5, it just has to be more than 2, really. So if you're down the back, you can be in a group together, that's close enough. If you're on the couches here, please come down and join us. Come down and join us. Okay, so, oh, I love it. So we've got about 5 there, fantastic. You can have more than 5. More than 5 is also fine. So let's see. If I have Yasmina, I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, and if you want to join the lovely Yasmina there, that'll be close enough. We can have more than 5 and you can have slightly less than 5, that's okay. So I need each one of you to actually pick one of these names. We have Aaliyah, Jane, Taylor, Ahmed, and that one is Reese. So assign a name to you. Don't have the same name unless you've got more than 5 people in your group, in which case you can double up, it's okay. Pick one of these names.
You have to pick a name.
Alright, looks like you're on.
Yes, pick 4.
Each of us have
He's
a
already
name.
picked it. Yeah,
Okay.
Ahmed.
yeah.
Does everyone have their name? You're going to be Jane. You did look like a Jane. You did look like a Jane. Okay. How are we going? Are you ready?
No, pick last.
Okay. So this is what you have just picked. If you're Aaliyah, you are an astronaut currently on mission. Oh no! Who picked Aaliyah? Aaliyah's hands in the air. Excellent. You look like a fantastic Aaliyah. Fantastic. Jane, you're a doctor in Norway. Who's Jane? Fantastic. Good. Absolutely. Taylor, you are Aaliyah's partner on Earth and you're gender neutral, so you can choose which way you're going to go there. So, Taylor, hands up if you're Taylor. Fantastic. Beautiful. So, Ahmed, you are an artist living in Hong Kong. Okay, there's our artist. Fantastic. And Reese, you are an extraterrestrial bacterium. I'm sorry, you made poor life choices. Excellent. Actually, Yasmina looks really happy to be our bacterium. Fantastic news. Okay. So those are your roles, and the rest of this is actually you doing the work. I gave you the theory, now you have to apply it. That's how it works. So, Jane and Reese, I have terrible news. I have terrible, terrible news for you. Norway has been affected by a viral pandemic without intervention. It is estimated 10% of your population, over 500,000 people, will die. A treatment has been developed that uses an element that is rare on Earth but plentiful in space. You have to just go with me here. It's not about the science, it's about the ethics, so just go with me. The element is currently giving a competitive advantage to Reese, our bacterium, who may one day evolve into a more complex life form. I give you no guarantees for what's going to happen to Reese, but it's possible. So, those are our problems, ethical problems. What are we going to do?
Kill the bacteria.
Kill the bacteria. Okay, so Sam does not want to give any rights. We can do 10%. Okay. So, I'm going to give you a few minutes in your groups to come up with what do you want. Not you personally, you as Jane. You as Reese. What do you want? What do you think the other people in your team want? How are you going to convince them to vote your way? And how are you going to ethically defend your choice? Spend a few minutes thinking about that.
No. There's a 1 in 10 chance.
It's a big deal.
Oh.
Once you necessarily kill it because if you kill
No, you're
then
an artist
tomorrow
in
next
Hong Kong. What do you
you are
think?
having another challenge.
All right.
Are you going to give
If it was somebody else who was playing Greece, would
You don't care.
But it is a different situation. If it's a victim, you can eventually
go back to their initial had but they have wiped out on that. And we have all their complex life.
it's still here.
so we can
It's not different disease. Yeah, it's not like stealing disease. Yeah, it's a virus. It's still happening people in Norway.
it's a bacteria.
Yeah, but you know, he deserves the right to live.
He also.
It's just Norway and all Norwegians like this, whatever.
All Norwegians like
We can do an
Poets and
You're the one that
Yeah, it's like the choice you have to make. Are you done or is he done?
We're all actually getting infected.
everybody just, I'm not just saying that.
It's either you die or he dies.
more jobs for you.
I think I'll give it a chance. But it is not the only
So you're happy to die?
Yes, because if nobody gives experiment, everybody has to learn. So if we never experimented, if you take in 1990s, 100s,
Yeah, I guess
I suggest we should let
But I thought you were saying that no, he doesn't have to die.
you don't need to complete law.
Maybe it's about time.
You need to research on the
Yes, that's your choice. That's your choice you were given. Do you
Okay, have our groups made a decision?
We're thinking black and white because we've got
resources.
Don't
Are you Reese?
So you seem to have a
Oh, you're the artist. So you're
Yeah.
doing it.
like I think black and white.
Okay.
because I think the concept is a bit.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
yeah, but
So we have a decision here. This team is winning.
I don't need
Do we have a decision over here? Not yet. Okay. 2 more minutes. Do we have a decision over here? Still working on it? You know what you're doing? You're good. Excellent.
If I was to say, I don't know, come up with a stupid answer. Do you want 2 sugars or 1 sugar? Alright, so if I
Or is it?
if I give you a choice between 3 sugars or 4 sugars and you say no 1 sugar, I'd say right. Like, it's not it would be that's how I think. If I pick something between A and B and you don't tell me A or B and you want to
So the
tell me
situation
something
is
between A or you want to tell me B, in my mind you think it's
Okay, we're going to bring it back now because we've got a few of these to do. Okay, so this table, what table? We don't have a table. This group, 1, you went first. So what did you decide? Are we going to kill the bacteria or not? No?
That's all of it.
Okay, so. Okay, fantastic. So we're actually going to cull the whole community. Not sure that's an ethical improvement. Okay, so you are going to take the hit on the human population. Okay.
What have we agreed?
No, we had 2 offense and 1 no. Only had 2. But this is a democracy. Always a democracy.
Don't waste your vote. Aha, very interesting. The reason they don't care is because I heard that I'm the artist, I'm the one in Hong Kong, and it doesn't affect me. So people don't care about things that don't affect them.
The question is, do we take the hit for the
Yeah, you
human
do.
or do we take
Yeah, you do. Okay, so this table over here, you're killing the bacteria.
They've changed their mind.
So are you killing or are you not killing?
We are killing the bacteria.
You're killing the bacteria. Okay, so that's 1 vote against, 1 vote for. Group in the back, are we killing the bacteria or not?
Bacteria's putting up a good fight.
It's putting up a fight. Good.
It looks like we found a compromise.
Oh, what's our compromise?
We save bacteria,
Yes.
we'll save a sample of bacteria,
This
and see what happens. And
Okay.
then this sort of like a zoo. We'll make bacteria zoo, see what happens.
Like it. Bacteria zoo. Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to keep the sample.
Sorry. Could you go back to the slides and explain the problem? Because I was saying it's black and white and we were getting great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, really interesting point that I want to highlight here. A lot of you are concerned about killing the bacteria. You want to save a sample of the bacteria. You're worried that you're going to kill a potential new species. But no one was actually worried about killing the virus. No one cared about the human virus. We're okay with just killing that because it's currently killing us. Okay, so you like just let the virus have its way.
Virus is alive.
Correct.
I thought that Reese was the virus.
Reese is the extraterrestrial bacterium.
Oh, okay.
The virus is what's currently killing the Norwegians.
You still
Okay.
have food to stop the virus.
Yeah.
Yes. We're going to sacrifice Reese to kill the virus to save the Norwegians. Or are we?
I think we've all.
We are, because Norwegians.
Yes, we are. We are very comfortable with that. Okay, and there's a whole other argument about what species we like to kill and which ones we don't, but we don't have time for that because Aaliyah and Taylor, I have some terrible, terrible news. Remember, Aaliyah, you're our astronaut, Taylor is your partner. Taylor was responsible for the development of the treatment for the pandemic currently affecting Norway. Aaliyah and her crew were infected by a co-worker and are not expected to survive without treatment. The crew can either harvest the element and treat themselves or send the shipment to Earth. Those are our choices. So, Aaliyah and her crew are going to die without this treatment. 10% of the Norwegian population are going to die on Earth without this treatment. What are we going to do? So, what do you want as your character? What do you think team members want treatment because they're closer to it?
Did we sit this one out because we're not harvesting it all?
You can decide as you would as your character. So it doesn't matter if you're Aaliyah or Taylor. Have a think as your character. What would you advise in this case? Spend a few minutes, have a think.
You're on Earth, and you're the doctor that made the treatment for the bacteria. Yeah. And I'm up there to harvest it, whatever. And I send it down. That's my job, right? And my job's, I got sick from the same bacteria, and they're asking, would I keep it in myself?
You and your husband are both
No.
Well, when you say herself,
I told you.
Yeah.
It's not enough for both.
I want to live. Save me. Do I get to use your convince your husband?
I think it's
What's the decision? I'm the stay-at-home dad.
You'll stay home dad, you're Taylor.
Yeah.
Okay, so Taylor created
He can go get medicine.
the drug. And her partner is off in space and needs drugs.
No.
Yeah.
Give it to me.
Hey,
I'm not I'm going to say Leah. Sorry,
You probably taught it to her when you were like 9 and she was 6. You probably said it one day.
I was so confused. Growing up, I was like, what? Thought experiment.
You better die.
Yeah, I'm up for that.
The treatment. It's no.
That should be a time frame. To complete it down is not.
That is wrong.
No,
Situation says you can just send it down or they
The medicine is saying, right?
no, you can't use the medicine, right? You have to harvest it in space.
Either they consume or they send it back. That's the
Why are you even here?
Okay. So, I'm just going to open this question to the floor. Does anyone think Aaliyah has a special claim to this treatment because her partner created it? Yeah? I like it.
Are you Aaliyah?
You're Taylor. You're Taylor. So Taylor created the drug. Aaliyah needs the drug.
I put the work in.
We're taking your medical license off you.
Okay.
Not if you
You'll
don't
never get
survive.
treatment again in the future.
Now you remember that trolley experiment that we mentioned? And how it gets really complicated if the one person on the other track is your mum. This is what we're dealing with here. Do we have a special right to treatment or something of that ilk if we were directly involved in its creation, or if someone in our family was? Does that impact who has the priority for limited resources? What are we thinking?
I have to look at it, what was my intention in creating it.
Yeah.
Wasn't just to save my mother, was I doing it right?
Oh, I like it. Intentionality matters. What if Taylor did create it specifically for a lion and they decide, we're going to give it to the population of Norway instead? Because there's more of them. Yeah. We have a challenge there. Okay. Now we're going to keep moving because otherwise we are going to run out of time. So, Ahmed.
Yeah.
I have some terrible news. It's not actually as bad as it sounds though. Nobody dies here. Yet. Ahmed created an artwork that involves lasers and unusual light displays. I'm told this would never lead to the solution that I'm actually going to propose here, but just imagine that it does. So, it was discovered his creation could be used in spy equipment such that governments could use their satellites to gather detailed topographical information about countries they are at war with. So, some citizens are protesting that displaying Ahmed's art is supporting international spying. Okay? So, what do you want in this particular, what we call a dual-use dilemma? So we've created a piece of technology that has good aims, beautiful piece of art. Also potentially has bad aims, spying, use in war, etc. Now this is very relevant for any tech that you might be creating. Always think about the dual-use dilemmas. You may have a positive outcome in mind. Someone else may co-opt your goal and actually use it in a negative way. So, what do you think others want? Is Ahmed under any obligation to withdraw his artwork?
No, I'm not.
This is his livelihood. So, we've got 2 votes saying definitely not. This is my art. And would it be different if he was a weapons scientist rather than an artist and this was discovered?
It also wouldn't.
Have a bit of a think.
It's my art, so I'm supposed to use how I want to use it.
That's straight. I think we should weaponize this virus in Norway.
Yeah. You wouldn't say the first.
Kill everybody. Let's just kill something.
Why was all of this me out? And now I'm just like virus on a laser.
It's funny because as soon as I read that, straight away I knew the answer was no, there's no moral obligation. And a large part of it is because the legislation actually talks about national interests, which include defence. And defence is also offensive.
Yep. Okay, so we've had 2 very, very vocal favours saying that we do not need to compromise our art.
This is interesting because this
Yeah.
is going on in Google right now.
Of course.
You also took a great option, no?
I'm not familiar with that.
It's a great option. Kept
So,
art but used it
a whole heap of employees of
No.
Google management.
He's saying it doesn't matter if he
is now going to use
keeps
what's
it
being
or
used
destroys
in
it.
development of
He's happy with it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the question is, should we get rid of should we
No, the question was,
should we
wasn't a
withdraw
great question, it
Google
was
from
like,
use completely
would you,
because of
Yeah. And I mean, can any of us name a single technology that doesn't have any dual-use dilemma?
No, of course not.
No, of course not. And I use an artistic example on purpose because people often defend the dual-use technologies as the technology is very, very valuable in its own right because it does X, Y, Z. And of course, art is valuable for its own sake as well, but it doesn't necessarily achieve those concrete outcomes that we often use to defend the development of dual-use technology. So, we've had 2 very firm votes. I do not need to compromise my art. Who's Ahmed on this table? Yep.
An artist in Hong Kong would not care so much, like because it's like powerless like citizen. But with my own understanding, my ethics system, I would protect that art piece and put it away. If I
Ooh, I like it.
discover that it has the power to change, and I don't trust the people who have the hands on it.
Yep.
So I would put it away and try to do work in a way that probably is not my experience with that art.
Excellent. So you think you have an ethical obligation to perhaps work on something else because there's potential misuse? And a few of the others said they had an ethical obligation to maintain their art.
But also the thing is, power is always how you think about it. So
Yeah.
it's not that you are always wherever the power is, and every choice you make is very powerful itself. So it's changing the conversation to what you define as power itself.
Yeah.
How do you
I like it. And of course, distributions of power are very much an ethical issue, and it touches on all the points that you've already raised about how do we control something as big as space? How do we make sure that we actually engage in space-related endeavours in an ethical way when it is such a massive thing and there's such a power imbalance between different countries and different organisations? And of course, it's a massive challenge. So we don't have an immediate solution to these issues. Yeah.
I actually don't think it's the power imbalance between countries or even institutions and private corporations. I think the power imbalance will change because there are people who are decisive rather than vacillating. People who don't want to think about the ethics will actually be the ones going ahead and changing the ethics so that in another generation, the questions we ask about space will be further to what our understanding of the right is. They won't go towards the left. More and more people will get accustomed to how things are done and will accept it.
Yes, absolutely. Status quo bias is very, very powerful. And of course, that's one thing that we do have an opportunity to sort of intervene in at the moment. We don't have a status quo for how we treat our moon colony. So we do get to decide a little bit in advance on that point. Yes, absolutely. And there are lots of similarities between the Antarctic missions and aerospace missions, right down to a number of medical sort of requirements across those two sort of remote or hostile environments, as we call them. So absolutely. Now I'm pretty sure this is our last example because we're running out of time. So this one affects Jane, Taylor, Ahmed and Reese, just to make sure we've got lots and lots of you. So big surprise, I've got some bad news, some very, very bad news for you. Earth is on the brink of ecological apocalypse and will no longer be able to sustain human life. A limited number of spacecraft are headed to nearby planet where a human colony will be established. Reese is the only life form that's being discovered on the planet but will not survive terraforming, very sadly. So if we make this environment suitable for humans, Reese will not survive. So you know what we're going to decide. We need to decide who's going to be on the spacecraft from the human population. How do we draw those boundaries? Who's actually going to be prioritised for survival?
The artist.
Are we allowed to terraform? Yes, the artist is a valid consideration. Is terraforming for human survival morally permissible, which means you're not doing the wrong thing if you terraform for our survival? Is it obligatory, meaning you're doing the wrong thing if you don't terraform for our survival? And how are you ethically going to defend this choice? Just spend a few minutes, you've done this before, you should be quite good at it by now. Try and figure out the answer to some of these questions. They're big questions.
Taylor needs to go first. She's doctor.
You will live like Fern.
Doctor in I don't need to go. See, I just gender and theoretically not both genders at the same time.
Oh, we can swap.
Yeah. But that's, I mean,
But it's ambiguous.
Yeah. So you went underpants all the time, even
Who doesn't?
And so he's certainly going to die.
Yes, Reese is going to die. How much do you care about Reese?
Nothing. We don't care about
You like Reese?
I think this is a natural evolution.
Yeah.
That's not evolution, that's just murder.
No, but
When the planet gets formed, how did it form?
he sounds in
It's not just okay one.
But there was
without
Not Reese.
what is under
Even at that point, different life forms of bacteria have died to evolve into something.
Yeah, but they haven't had humans.
Yeah, so bacteria is something that they will always evolve. Even if you kill them because
Somehow it sounds like we have less dissent on this question than on the others, which is interesting.
but bacteria is something that will evolve.
Priorities. Has anyone prioritised people to survive? Yes? Who's surviving? People who funded the project. Okay. So very rich people get to survive. Excellent. We have a few dissenters in the group, I see. And who are we prioritising?
Doctors with their appendix removed.
Doctors with their appendix removed, absolutely. So we've already discussed the mandatory appendectomies for space doctors and Antarctic doctors. So there you go. But yes, space doctors without their appendix. Who else are we going to prioritise? Not Reese. Did anyone vote for Reese?
I did.
You did. You like Reese.
Why do you like Reese so much?
He's not the dog.
Okay.
No.
So, we are out of time, which means I get to leave you with one to think about. So this one was for Ahmed, Aliyah and Jane. Bad news for our pigeon.
Yeah.
Asteroid. Gotta have one of these. Hurtling toward Earth, expected to strike Hong Kong.
And I'm gonna say
Artist. And the only possible intervention would be for Aliyah's crew to deflect the asteroid so it hits Norway instead. This will lead to an estimated 5 million deaths.
Yes.
This is what you want to think about. This is what I'm leaving you to go away and think about.
We
You don't
will
have to do it
take
now.
all of Norway's money.
What do you want? Would Hong Kong being struck just be bad luck, while Aliyah deflecting this asteroid would be human action? Remember, if you develop a piece of technology, that's human action. It's not a mistake, it's not bad luck. You do have ethical responsibilities for the tech you create. How are you going to defend your choice? So we are finished now. That is something for you to actually go away and think about. Good luck with all your space apps. I hope they are very, very good. And thank you for being involved in the Space Ethics Workshop.
Right, it's the same like asking if there is a bomb or it's going to happen. Is there a way I can shift? It's a natural event versus
Feel free to have questions.
it's a natural event. Deflecting is wrong. It's a natural event. Either you try to destroy that.
And what about not is more medicines?
5 million in Norway.
Can we split the asteroid so that it hits Hong Kong and Norway? Just so it's fair?
If that's what you've decided you want to do, then yes.
And then after that,
If you think about it, right? Norway is more beautiful, but
Norway is not scientifically advanced.
no, is Norway contributing to global economy?
yeah.
Come on, Norway medicines are
Hong
so
Kong
much
is like
different.
one. It's like Hong Kong is the
No,
Silicon Valley.
Norway is a very advanced country.
No, not about the investment. Like, so
Investment is contributing to the global economy.
I'm talking
Norwegian medicines are, Norway medicine research is very ahead of the whole world.
Plus they have
If you know about diabetes, maximum of the medicine research in diabetes is done in Norway, and diabetes
I think the question is not about
Norway is very high in
the
medicine.
question is placed is it's a natural event. The only thing you can either you can minimize the impact rather than saying divert it. It's natural.
yeah, millions a lot of people. Like so, 2 million people.
No, it's like a
can
tsunami.
actually like say alright.
Hong Kong is a Singapore.
Hong Kong's depression stands is proud.
Yeah.
Whereas
7
Norway
million,
is a
that's
huge country from about 3,000 kilometers.
Aren't they killing the whole idea?
Ask this question, would you kill 7 million people?
Norway, it's a culture we are representing. Aren't we representing? Norway represents a culture. Hong Kong
Yeah,
No, they're just giving
part
names.
of
They're just giving
I think they just
names.
gave the number.
I am not.
They're just giving names to play this hypothetical situation. Would you kill 7 million people?
What they are saying is
Norway
that
is a
space, so you have an equipment which can divert. If I can divert the
Yeah, would you
asteroid, why
push a
wouldn't I
button?
try to destroy
Would you
the
push a
asteroid?
button to kill 5 million instead of 7 million people?
There are two things. What would you do? A natural event like tsunami which occurs, what would you do? It's about the
It's
natural
like let's
man-made event.
not take North Hong Kong versus Indonesia versus
Yeah, it's a tough choice.
I love it when people just like that. I mean, I appreciate the fact that you've decided and have been the whole time all been wrong.
No, you are taking
But
the
it's
number
just like,
form.
yeah.
I am taking the whole, like we are finishing the Norwegian culture.
No,
I'm
that's
taking
associated
that.
Oh, look,
with
Norwegian's not a culture. No, the Danes and the Swedes are exactly the same people as the Norwegians. You're not taking a culture away. Plus, I think
Who were you in, Jen?
So you're coming tomorrow?
Yeah,
Oh, really? You don't want to do it now? Yeah. Alright.
See you, man. I'll get told before.
Tomorrow, no.
Then the Australia's Oscars twice to be returned down to 7.
What's starting at 3:30?
Dinner for a hackathon at 5 o'clock.
But hackathon is
Are you guys going to do a hackathon?
we didn't do
This
it.
time we just wanted to get
We don't.
what normally goes inside.
No, we didn't
This is
know
the first
what
time
it
that
is.
we are coming over
No
here.
one knows what it is. It doesn't matter. That's the whole point. This whole weekend is all about coming up with an idea for a space related business. And so it doesn't matter what it is. You just have to basically come up with a problem and then say this is the solution.
See, we didn't even know that part. I thought they will be like real people want to.
No, not at all. I'm not doing anything technical. I'm doing law. And so
But we were not aware of that.
anything. So all you basically have to do is like support yourself.
He's packing, he cannot start up his
No, I
life.
think that's a good thing. Probably that we just need to brainstorm see
Nobody's brainstorming. That's what these guys are doing.
Right now you cannot do that.
I think they are doing behind the walls.
Yeah, but they don't.